The silence of the nursery was the most expensive thing Kaelen had ever bought for her. After the fire and the betrayal of the gala, Zola finally felt like she could breathe. She ran a hand over her growing belly, looking at the city skyline she had helped rebuild. But in the world of the vanguard, peace is often just the eye of the storm.
Thwack.
The sound was sharp, like a whip cracking against ice. Zola froze as a spiderweb of cracks bloomed across the unbreakable glass. Pinned to the center of the window by a single black-tipped arrow was a heavy vellum envelope. With trembling hands, Zola reached out. The paper wasn't a letter, it was a notice of erasure. At the bottom, where a signature should be, was a seal she had never seen, a golden compass held by a skeletal hand. Suddenly, a burner phone hidden inside a nearby diaper bag began to vibrate with a violent hum. Zola answered it, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He told you his name was Kaelen, didn't he?" A woman's voice whispered, cold, elegant, and devoid of mercy. "But to the Conglomerate, he is simply Asset 402. And today, your husband's debt has come due. Tell him the Curator is here to collect the port." Zola looked out the window. Down at the harbor, a fleet of black ships that didn't belong to Kaelen was docking in the dark. The Iron Shadow had met his match, and this time, Zola wouldn't just be the one being saved. She was the only one who could see the trap they were already standing in. Kaelen entered the nursery a split second after the glass shattered, his movements a blur of lethal grace. He didn't look at the broken window first. He went straight to Zola, shielding her body with his own as his eyes scanned every corner of the room. When he saw the black-tipped arrow and the notice of erasure, his jaw tightened so hard it looked like granite. He took the burner phone from Zola's trembling hand, listening to the silence on the other end before crushing the device in his palm. He led Zola away from the window and sat her down, his hands steady even as the air around him turned cold. Zola looked at him, her voice a whisper as she asked who the Curator was and why they called him Asset 402. Kaelen took a deep breath, the shadow of a dark past crossing his face. He revealed that before he was the owner of the port, he was a nameless soldier for a global conglomerate. He explained that the Vanguard wasn't just a security team he had hired, they were the men who had escaped that life with him. Years ago, he had been their top operative, a man used to clear obstacles for powerful people. He had spent a fortune and spilled blood to buy his freedom and the freedom of his men, thinking the debt was paid in full when he built his shipping empire. He had created his power specifically to protect a woman like Zola, hoping the Iron Shadow would be enough to hide his old life forever. "They don't see me as a man, Zola," Kaelen said, his voice low and heavy with regret. "To them, I am property they want back." He explained that the Conglomerate was the same entity that had funded Vane's fraudulent projects, and now that Vane had failed, they were coming to reclaim everything Kaelen had built. Zola looked at her husband, seeing the pain behind his strength. She realized that the peace they had found was built on a secret war that was far from over. Kaelen took her hand and promised that he would dismantle the ghosts of his past once and for all, because he refused to let his family pay for the sins of the Conglomerate. The following morning, Zola tried to focus on her work, but the shadow of Kaelen's past hung heavy in her mind. She was sitting in her architectural studio, surrounded by the peaceful designs of the Horizon Sanctuary, when the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Without an appointment or a sound, a woman walked in and sat across from her with a poise that felt sharper than a blade. This was the Curator, a woman dressed in a suit of surgical white, her eyes as cold and gray as the sea in winter. The Curator didn't offer a greeting. Instead, she placed a sleek, silver tablet on Zola's mahogany desk. On the screen was a liquidation offer, a document that detailed the total seizure of every asset Kaelen and Zola owned, including the Horizon Sanctuary. She spoke in a voice that was elegant and entirely devoid of mercy, explaining that Zola was merely a temporary distraction for Asset 402. The Curator told her that the Conglomerate didn't care about Zola's architectural dreams or the lives she was trying to save. "You are holding on to a man who belongs to us," the Curator said, her gaze moving over Zola's pregnancy with a chilling indifference. She offered Zola a choice. She could sign over the port and the sanctuary, and in return, the conglomerate would allow her to leave with her child and enough money to start a quiet life far away. But if she refused, the curator promised that Kaelen would be reclaimed by force, and everything Zola had built would be turned into a monument of her failure. Zola felt the familiar surge of fear, but this time, it was different. She looked at the woman who saw her husband as property and her work as a liability, and she felt a spark of the iron shadow's defiance. She didn't touch the tablet. Instead, she looked the curator in the eye and told her that in this city, she was no longer a ghost, and Kaelen was no longer an asset. As the curator stood up to leave, her cold smile suggested that the war for the port had officially begun. The studio was still for only a moment after the curator left, but the silence was quickly broken by the frantic ringing of Zola's work phone. It was the site manager from the Horizon Sanctuary, his voice nearly drowned out by the sound of sirens and grinding metal. He shouted that the automated crane systems had gone haywire, moving heavy steel beams as if they had a mind of their own. Zola rushed to her central computer, her heart hammering. She tried to log into the site's security network, but the screen was a mess of flickering red code and the same skeletal hand seal she had seen on the Arrow. The conglomerate's first strike wasn't with bullets, but with data. They had launched a massive cyber attack, hacking into the very digital blueprints Zola had used to build her dream. Across the city, her construction sites turned into zones of chaos. Elevators in half-finished buildings began to drop and rise at dangerous speeds, and the digital locks on the heavy equipment storage unit snapped shut, trapping workers inside. Zola watched in horror on her monitors as a massive support beam, controlled by the hacked system, swung toward a group of terrified laborers. She realized then that her own intelligence was being used against her. The curator had turned Zola's precise designs into a map for destruction. Every safety sensor she had installed was now being overridden. The digital blueprints, which were supposed to be the foundation of a better life for the displaced, had been transformed into weapons. It was a clear message from the conglomerate. They could reach into the very heart of her work and turn it into a nightmare. Kaelen burst into the room, his vanguard team already moving to secure the building's physical perimeter, but the battle was happening in the wires. He saw the sweat on Zola's brow as her fingers flew across the keyboard, trying to manually bypass the rogue commands. With one final desperate override, she managed to cut the power to the main crane, freezing the heavy beam just inches before it could cause a tragedy. The chaos stopped as quickly as it had begun, leaving the city in a tense, buzzing silence. Zola slumped in her chair, realizing that the curator wasn't just trying to take the port. She was trying to prove that Zola's brilliance was a liability that would eventually hurt the people she loved. The air in the high-security safe room was thick with tension, far heavier than the smoke still rising from the construction sites across the city. Kaelen paced the floor like a caged predator, his jaw set and his eyes fixed on the monitors showing his vanguard teams mobilizing. He was already issuing orders for a direct counterstrike, his voice a low growl as he spoke of hunting the curator's shadow units and meeting their violence with double the force. To him, the world was a battlefield, and the only way to protect his family was to crush the threat before it could breathe again. Zola watched him, her hand resting protectively over her belly. She didn't want more blood on the foundations of their home. She stood up, her voice trembling but firm, and told him that force was exactly what the conglomerate expected. She argued that if they fought like soldiers, they would be playing the curator's game, but if they fought like architects, they could dismantle the entire structure of the enemy. She wanted to use the data from the cyber attack to trace the conglomerate's illegal financial web and expose their corruption to the global authorities. She believed that the truth was the only weapon that could truly set them free. Kaelen stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression a mix of love and sheer terror. He told her that exposure took time, and time was a luxury they didn't have while an arrow was aimed at their nursery. He argued that the conglomerate owned the very people she wanted to report them to. He believed that only fire could stop fire. He wanted to move Zola to a hidden location and disappear into the shadows to finish this his way, the way of Asset 402. The room felt small as their visions clashed. Zola realized that for the first time, they were looking at the same enemy but seeing two different wars. She told him that if he became a monster to save them, they would lose the very peace they had fought so hard to build. She didn't want to live in a fortress built on secrets. She wanted to live in a world where their children didn't have to hide. Kaelen looked at her, his hands clenched into fists, torn between the instinct to destroy and the desperate need to be the man Zola believed he was. For a long moment, the Iron Shadow and the Architect stood at a cross, the future of their family hanging in the balance. The offshore rig stood like a solitary giant amidst the crashing waves of the deep harbor, a fortress of steel and salt far from the reach of the city's hijacked networks. Here, surrounded by the churning dark water, Kaelen's vanguard held a silent perimeter. Inside the command module, the roar of the ocean was reduced to a low hum. Zola sat by a small portal window, watching the white foam break against the pillars. She felt the isolation of the rig, realizing that they were now truly cut off from the world she had tried to build. Kaelen approached her, his silhouette blocking the dim light of the monitors. The anger from their earlier clash had faded, replaced by a weary vulnerability she had never seen. He sat across from her and finally spoke of the years before the storm at the construction site. He confessed that when he was still Asset 402, he had been assigned to monitor her, long before they ever officially met. The Conglomerate had seen her early brilliance as a potential tool, but Kaelen had seen something else. He had seen a woman who believed in a world that wasn't broken, a woman whose designs were meant to heal, not to control. He revealed that the port wasn't just a business he had built for himself, it was a wall he had spent a decade constructing to keep her safe from the people he served. He had funneled his secret wealth into a legal empire so that one day, he could offer her a life where her name would be on the buildings instead of her blood on the floor. He hadn't just saved her that night in the rain. He had been waiting for the chance to choose her over the shadows for years. The empire was his apology to the world, and his gift to the only person who made him feel like a man instead of a weapon. Zola reached out, taking his hand, her heart aching at the weight he had carried in silence. She realized that while she had been building for the city, he had been building for her. But she also saw the flaw in his design. He was still trying to be her shield when she was ready to be his partner. She told him that a wall built on secrets would always have a crack for the Curator to find. As the rig swayed gently in the tide, they sat in the quiet, finally understanding that to survive the Conglomerate, they had to stop being a protector and a protected, and start being a single, unbreakable force. The offshore rig was supposed to be a closed system, a perfect grid where every movement was accounted for. But as the hours passed, Zola found herself staring at the security monitors with the same intensity she used to study a complex blueprint. To anyone else, the shifting dots representing the vanguard guards were just a routine patrol. To Zola, they were lines in a drawing, and one of those lines didn't connect. She noticed a tiny, repeating flaw. Every hour, on the hour, a guard on the lower eastern deck would pause for exactly 3 seconds near a ventilation shaft before moving on. It was a rhythmic hiccup that didn't match the Vanguard's standard tactical pacing. While Kaelen was busy coordinating with the teams back on the mainland, Zola zoomed in on the feed. She didn't look at the guard's face, she looked at his shadows. He was planting something, a small, silver transmitter designed to mimic the frequency of the rig's own sensors. Zola didn't scream or panic. She found Kaelen in the communications hub and pulled him aside, showing him the playback. She pointed out the structural inconsistency in the guard's movements, explaining that someone who truly belonged to the Vanguard wouldn't leave a blind spot that large unless it was intentional. Kaelen's eyes darkened as he recognized the man, a soldier who had been with him since the early days of the port. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound, but Zola's steady hand on his arm kept him focused. She realized the transmitter wasn't just for tracking, it was a beacon for the Curator's fleet. The steel scandal had taught her how to spot hidden rot, and now she was seeing it in their own ranks. Instead of having Kaelen arrest the man immediately, Zola suggested a different plan. She wanted to feed the transmitter false data, leading the Curator to believe they were moving back to the city while they secretly prepared the rig for a final stand. For the first time, Kaelen looked at Zola and saw the strategic mind of a commander. She had spotted the crack in the foundation before the building could fall, proving that her eye for detail was the most lethal weapon they possessed. Back in the city, The Horizon Sanctuary was nearly finished, its towering glass walls reflecting the light of a new day. But as Zola sat at her drafting table, she wasn't thinking about aesthetics. She was thinking about survival. With the traitor on the rig successfully feeding the Curator false information, Zola had a small window of time to do what she did best: rewrite the rules of the space they occupied. She opened the master files for the Sanctuary's digital brain. To the world, the building was a community center for the displaced, but under Zola's frantic, brilliant fingers, it became a living trap. She began to alter the internal designs, hiding tactical trapdoors within the decorative floor patterns and rewiring the high-speed elevators to respond only to her biometric signature. She didn't just see walls, she saw a maze that only she and Kaelen could navigate. Zola integrated the building's advanced ventilation system with the fire suppression units, creating a way to flood specific corridors with non-lethal gas at the touch of a button. She even modified the glass panels in the grand atrium, turning them into a massive array of sensors that would track any unauthorized movement. She was building a sanctuary, in every sense of the word, a place that offered peace to the innocent but promised a nightmare for the invaders. When Kaelen found her hours later, he stared at the screen, his tactical mind immediately grasping the brilliance of her modifications. She had created absolute defense without firing a single shot. Zola looked up at him, her eyes tired but sharp. She told him that the Curator wanted the sanctuary because she thought it was a prize, but Zola was going to make sure that once the Conglomerate stepped inside, they would find that the building itself had teeth. They weren't just going to wait for the storm, they were going to house it. The night of the grand opening arrived with a deceptive elegance. The Horizon Sanctuary glowed like a jewel against the dark harbor, its glass walls shimmering under thousands of lights. To the city, it was a celebration of rebirth. To the Curator, it was the perfect place to execute a final liquidation. As the elite filtered into the grand atrium, Zola stood at the top of the marble staircase, her hand resting on Kaelen's arm. They looked like a couple at the height of their power, but beneath the surface, Zola's pulse was a countdown. The Curator entered with her shadow units, disguised as high-level investors. She moved through the crowd with a cold smile, her eyes locked on Zola. She believed she had already won, thinking Kaelen's vanguard was outmatched by her global reach. But as she reached the center of the atrium, the Curator stopped. She felt a subtle vibration beneath her feet, the mechanical heart of the building shifting. "You should have looked closer at the blueprints," Zola whispered, her voice amplified through the hidden speakers in the walls. With a single tap on her tablet, Zola activated the kill zone. The grand atrium transformed in seconds. The heavy reinforced glass panels hissed shut, sealing the exits with a sound like a tomb closing. The floor plates shifted, rising and falling to create a labyrinth of steel barriers that separated the Curator from her guards. The lights flickered from warm gold to a harsh, blinding white, disorienting the invaders. The Curator's team tried to override the system, but they found no digital entry point. Zola had moved the building's brain to an offline, analog circuit that only she could control. The high-speed elevators dropped into the basement, locking away the backup units, while the ventilation system began to hum, filling the isolated corridors with a thick, neutralizing mist that forced the shadow units to their knees. The Curator stood alone in the center of the hall, stripped of her weapons and her power. Kaelen stepped forward, no longer a weapon of the Conglomerate, but the master of the house Zola had designed. He didn't need to fire a shot. The building itself had disarmed the world's most dangerous organization. Zola looked down at the woman who had tried to erase her family, seeing the terror in her eyes as the Curator realized she was trapped in a masterpiece. The sanctuary had done its job. It had protected the innocent and swallowed the threat whole. The Curator was not the only one trapped. The Conglomerate's entire digital existence was now caught in Zola's net. While the silent alarms of the sanctuary kept the physical threat contained, Zola and Kaelen retreated to the building's core, a room shielded by 3 feet of lead and copper mesh. This was the dead zone, the only place where the global entity couldn't reach them. Zola plugged the drive containing the captured data from the offshore rig into the console. Beside her, Kaelen entered a series of long dormant codes, his final gift as Asset 402. Together, they bypassed the Conglomerate's firewalls. On the screens, a terrifying map of the world appeared, glowing with thousands of points of light. Each point represented an illegal bank account, a bribed official, or a fraudulent construction project like veins. They thought they were invisible because they were everywhere, Zola said, her fingers dancing across the screen. But an architect knows that the bigger the structure, the more weight it puts on the foundation. And their foundation is made of lies. With a single synchronized command, they initiated the data breach. They didn't just delete the information, they sent it simultaneously to every major news outlet, international court, and law enforcement agency on the planet. In real time, they watched as the points of light began to blink out. Across the globe, bank accounts were frozen, and arrest warrants were generated by the thousands. The faceless men who had pulled the strings from the shadows were suddenly exposed to the light. The conglomerate's power began to evaporate like mist in the sun. Without their money and their secrets, they were nothing. Kaelen watched the screen until the very last node turned red and then went dark. He felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had carried for half a lifetime. He turned to Zola, who was leaning back in her chair, exhausted but triumphant. The Iron Shadow was no longer a ghost, and the architect was no longer a victim. They had dismantled a global empire using nothing but the truth and a set of better plans. As the sun began to rise over the harbor, the world outside was waking up to a new reality, one where the conglomerate no longer existed, and the port was finally, truly free. The chaos of the previous night had been replaced by a silence so deep it felt like a blessing. A few months had passed since the fall of the conglomerate, and the world was a different place. The headlines were no longer filled with scandals or threats, but with the success of the Horizon Sanctuary and the new laws protecting workers across the globe. Zola stood in the garden of their home, the air sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine. The harbor below was busy, but the ships now carried honest cargo, and the port belonged to the people who worked it. She felt a familiar kick against her ribs, a reminder that life was continuing, stronger and more vibrant than before. Kaelen walked out to join her, carrying their first child on his shoulder. He looked younger, the hard lines of Asset 402 completely erased from his face. He wasn't a shadow anymore. He was a man standing in the full light of day. He reached out and placed his hand over Zola's, feeling the steady heartbeat of their growing family. A week later, the nursery that had once been a site of a terrifying breach was filled with a much softer sound, the rhythmic breathing of a newborn. The second child had arrived, a girl with Zola's eyes and Kaelen's quiet strength. They named her Hope, a simple name for a future that was no longer a dream, but a reality. There were no more hidden transmitters, no more notices of erasure, and no more debts to be paid. The Vanguard had transformed into a legitimate security firm, led by men who finally had homes and families of their own. Zola had been officially recognized as the lead architect of the new era, and her blueprints were being used to build sanctuaries in cities she had never even visited. As the sun set, casting a warm orange glow over the nursery, Kaelen leaned down to kiss Zola's forehead. They stood together by the window, the glass now clear and unbroken, looking out at a horizon that was finally theirs to keep. The war was over, the restoration was absolute, and for the first time in their lives, they were simply a family, living peacefully in the light they had built together. The war for the port has ended. The Curator is a memory, the Conglomerate is a ghost, and the shadows that once haunted Kaelen have finally been burned away by the light. Zola and Kaelen didn't just survive the collapse. They rebuilt the world from the blueprints of their own resilience. From the rainy streets of betrayal to the golden balconies of the Horizon Sanctuary, they proved that no empire is stronger than a family that refuses to break. They have found the one thing money and power could never buy: absolute peace. Their story is a reminder that even when the world tries to erase you, your brilliance is a signature that cannot be rubbed out. The Iron Shadow and the Architect are ghosts no more. They are the foundation of a new legacy. Thank you for following this journey of justice, love, and restoration from start to finish. If you enjoyed this epic saga and want to see more stories of high-stakes drama and ultimate revenge, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, Rose Noir Tales. Join our community of storytellers by hitting that like button and letting me know your favorite moment in the comments section. Until next time, keep building your own horizon.